This is HealthCall Online, where you hear extended versions of interviews featured in our weekly radio broadcast, the HealthCall Radio Hour, heard on stations around the country and national syndication. Well, I'm sure you've heard the big debate. It's been going on for years. Does money buy happiness? Well, the answer is maybe, according to research. So let's dive into that and learn a little more about how you can spend money in pursuit of happiness. And our guest on this segment is Amit Kumar. He is the assistant professor of marketing and psychology at the University of Texas at Austin's McCombs School of Business. His research on happiness has been published very widely. So let's jump right in there at the big question. Can money buy happiness?
Well, it can. It sort of just depends on how you're using that money. So perhaps if people spent their money in certain ways, they might be more likely to be happier, but we don't always make sort of wise decisions with the money that we have. And of course, that can impact our happiness as well.
Sure. Yeah, we're going to talk about buyer's remorse and many other things. But let's back right up there to your research and what have you learned about how or where to spend money to achieve the most happiness?
So in our studies, we find that people tend to derive more satisfaction from their experiential purchases. So these are experiences like travel, tickets to events, meals out, outdoor activities and recreation. So these experiences, money that you spend on doing, than they do from material purchases, money that you spend on having, on material possessions like clothing and jewelry and furniture and gadgets and so on. And it turns out that this difference in the sort of value that people derive from consuming experiences rather than material things extends across a pretty broad time course. So in terms of when they're looking forward to experiences they're going to have, when they're actually experiencing them, and also when they're looking back and recalling some significant experiences they've had in their lives.
So I get it. So buying that new pair of shoes is going to be a one and done, and I'm over it and I move on. I'm not going to look back fondly and remember the shoes as well as a vacation or a dinner out as those things you just mentioned.
Yeah, so we do tend to adapt to our material possessions. It's not necessarily one and done. You might get a little more value out of your shoes, but in terms of sort of the enduring satisfaction that you derive, experiences tend to go a longer way. Part of that is because of what we know about happiness more broadly. Even when we're thinking about things beyond how we're spending our money, it turns out that one of the biggest predictors of happiness is our social relationships. And so to the extent that you can use your money in ways that enhance those social relationships, and experiences are more likely to do that, the more likely you are to get value from those purchases. So for instance, people tend to talk to others more about their experiences than their material goods. People aren't that interested in hearing about your new shoes, but they do want to hear about the new restaurant you tried or the place you just visited. And the fact that this kind of makes the fodder for social interaction, these experiences provide conversational value. That's part of the reason for why we tend to derive more happiness from experiences than from material purchases.
I get it. So the more you can talk about it and relive the experience later, the more value and happiness you're likely to derive out of it. Even if it's negative in the moment, and I'm thinking of a particular circumstance in my life. I was on a sailboat, delivering a sailboat across Lake Michigan, and it was brutal. I mean, we were into the wind at 25 knots and banging up and down on 6-foot waves for hour after hour after hour. And I was so seasick. It was a horrible experience. But I look back on it now and oddly remember that fondly. Is misery in the moment somehow related to positive memories?
Positive things tend to be remembered positively as well. But one of the interesting things about experiences, again, compared to possessions, is that they continue to exist only in our minds. So material possession might become more negative over time. We face frustrations when our gadgets aren't working the way that we want them to, or we get used to the thing that we've had for a while and a new version comes out and all of a sudden we're less interested in the one that we already have. But with experiences, these are mental representations that we have. And part of what that allows for is this sort of reframing that you were referring to after the fact. We can reconstrue these in a more positive light. That's one of the things that happens as we weave them into sort of the narrative of our lives. We're telling stories about ourselves. We're establishing our own identities. That was probably a very important trip in your life, given that you're continuing to talk about it now. Mm-hmm. And sometimes things that weren't so great in the moment. There's a well-known study about a 3-week bicycle trip across the country that's a little like the story you just told. And, people, these cyclists are suffering through downpours. It's raining, you're uphill, it's strenuous, you're sweating. But when you recall these moments afterwards, these riders tend to say things like, not just that it was great, but maybe it was good that it rained. So even that negative thing is all of a sudden, it's something that brought us closer together. And when we can think about it in that way, we can derive more value from it.
So if I'm seeking an experience, to spend money on an experience that I want to bring happiness to my life, are there some guidelines around that? Is it based on price? Is it based on who I'm with? Is it based on the amount of physical activity involved? What tends to generate the greatest amount of happiness in an experience?
So this is why I think it's useful to think about sort of why we derive more happiness from our experiences than from our material goods. And when we understand that why, I think that provides a little insight into, well, what kinds of experiences should we be engaging in? So part of what we've been talking about for this whole conversation is sort of about the social value that we derive from our experiences. That's part of why we get so much happiness from them. And so purchases that are more social in nature tend to bring us more happiness. So when we do things, it's probably a good idea to do them with others. That's not a hard and fast rule. Some solitary experiences might provide us with some enduring satisfaction as well. But to the extent that we're using our money, we're making these purchases to promote our social relationships, the more likely we are to derive happiness from them. Just as we were talking about before, in that same vein, the more that we talk about our experiences, the more value that we'll get from them. One way to think about experiences, if you were being a bit of a cynic about this research that we've conducted, is that they can be a bit fleeting. When you go on a trip, it lasts for a few days or a few weeks if you're lucky. When you go on a night out on the town or something like that, that's a few hours at most. But these experiences live on in our memories and the stories we tell. And so the more that we're engaging with them, especially in the social way, the more likely we are to derive value from them. Another reason that that I alluded to that we haven't talked a ton about is this identity relevant aspect of it. So when we're thinking about who we are, what's our sense of self, our material goods sort of don't make up who we are as much as our experiences do. And so what we want to try to invest in is sort of investments that contribute to who we are. So when you're thinking about your identity, what's the kind of person you see yourself as? If you're using money in that way, you'll probably derive more value from it. I guess one last thing that I'll mention before we move on from this particular topic is that one of the troublesome things about money and happiness is that we're often engaging in comparisons with other people, and those comparisons can be deflating. So when you think about the realm of material goods, if somebody has a nicer TV than you do, or they have a fancier wardrobe, that can bother you. It can be annoying also to find out that someone who has the same gadget that you have paid substantially less for it. And so to the extent that we can try to avoid some of these destructive comparisons, the more that we'll get out of the purchases that we're making and in terms of the happiness that we derive from them. And I think if you put all of these things together, that sort of suggests that if you're investing in something that's relevant to your identity, you can think of it as uniquely yours when you're talking about yourself with other people. And so you might not even engage in these same comparisons. Sure, people can go on better vacations or get better seats to the show or something like that. But we can evaluate experiences sort of on our own terms rather than relative to the purchases that other people have made. That's a bit harder to do with possessions that we've bought.
So, how does that change as we move into our later years? If I'm heading into retirement or even beyond that in older age, are there things to think about there about trying to find happiness with money?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's interesting is actually research suggests that that people get a bit happier as they age. Part of that might have to do with discovering who you are over time. And so that's the good news, but there's of course bad news that like loneliness can be a huge problem for elderly folks. That's something that we want to combat. And so that's part of the reason we've been talking about social relationships and how experiences can contribute to them. With respect to sort of spending money, we do always sort of collect demographic information in our studies, and we actually we don't consistently find significant age effects. So the way to interpret that is that it turns out that people, sort of both young and old, tend to derive more satisfaction from experiential purchases than they do from material purchases. So this isn't sort of a young people thing or an old people thing. This seems to be a people thing. But that said, I do think it's possible that there could be some differences in the types of experiences that people derive value from as they age. So, when young people are thinking about this research and what sorts of experiential purchases they want to invest in, they might be thinking about things like skydiving, these extraordinary, unique, special experiences that they might have. Obviously, that might be a bit more of a challenge as you get older. But part of this has to do, again, with our identity. So maybe that's part of discovering what your identity is when you're young. What's your identity when you're older? Your identity might have a lot more to do with that restaurant you go to every week with your friends. And so if that's something that's contributing to your identity, that type of experience, ordinary as it may seem relative to skydiving, can also contribute to your happiness. That said, I think the overall message of this is that people of all ages would be wise to at least shift some of their spending sort of a bit less in the direction of material goods and a bit more in the direction of experiences like travel and dining and taking in the arts.
Yeah, I think that's great. Tell me more about your research into happiness and things that I may not understand about what makes people happy and how to feel happy.
So broadly, I think the largest lesson here is that other people are what make us happy. And so that seems somewhat obvious. I think what's less obvious is why people don't always pursue the things that are going to make them feel better. And so when we think about that, we might want to consider the decisions that we're making in a different light. So another thing that we can do is invest in other people. We can be pro-social or other-oriented. We can do things for others. That tends to make them feel good, of course, and it also tends to make us feel good. And so I think when we're thinking about why don't we make decisions in this way, or why do we sometimes choose not to, it's because we don't fully understand sort of the consequences of our actions. And so when we're thinking about pro-social behavior or sort of being kind to others, we might not realize the impact we're having. And if we knew the impact we were having, that might make us be more likely to engage in those sorts of activities. When it comes to experiential consumption, we might think things along the lines of, is this going to be a good financial investment? My stuff, at least I can hold on to that. I can keep it in my possession. And so maybe that seems like a better sort of economic decision. People sometimes think that when they're choosing what to spend money on. But if you ask them afterwards what sort of represented a better financial decision, a better investment, money better spent, they'll tell you that it was the experiences they had. And so we might be sort of not realizing how we'll feel in the long term when we make these decisions with our resources, be it our money or our time or our effort and energy.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think a lot of people feel as though they shouldn't spend money on themselves, and it's wasteful, or I think a word that used in your research often is hedonistic to spend money on something for myself. So maybe we need to rethink that, huh? As long as we're spending it on experiences that are designed to improve our social quotient, maybe that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, I think spending on others is another way to sort of advance our happiness, and so I'm certainly not suggesting that spending on yourself is going to feel better than spending on others. In fact, spending on others, whether it's buying them a cup of coffee or just buying a cookie for someone else, that's actually something that can make you feel happy as well. But certain purchases that we make for ourselves can also make us happy, and they tend to be social in nature as well. We can even think about when we're spending money on other people, we have decisions about what we're using that money on. So if you're buying a gift for someone, for instance, you could buy them a material item that they could keep in their possession, and you might think that that's a great gift because you can see them opening the box and they get to store it in their house and have it forever or something like that. But you might actually feel more connected to that other person if you give them an experience instead. And if you share that experience with them, perhaps even better for both you and for them and for your relationship with each other.
Great point. Great point. Hey, let's get into the dirt a little bit here. Why is it that incredibly wealthy families are so just riven with divorce and drug abuse and all those other things? If money can buy happiness, man, they got tons of money, but some of them appear to have very little happiness. What's going on there? Has research kind of evaluated that?
So I think the research is actually becoming clearer and clearer that money can buy happiness, but that's not to say that money necessarily will buy happiness. And so I think this gets back to what we're doing with that money. So in some sense, there are negative outcomes that can occur if we're constantly chasing after something else that someone else has. Then we'll probably never be satisfied. And that's a choice that you can make when you have lots of money. And so I think the important thing to take away is, well, what are you going to do with that money? How are you going to spend it? And if you spend it in ways that are more likely to promote happiness, then yeah, that money is going to result in more happiness. In some ways, it should be a good thing that, money gives you choices. It gives you flexibility. It gives you the ability to do what you want to do, to choose how to spend it. But that doesn't necessarily give you the insight into choosing wisely. And so the hope here is that if people learn about sort of the scientific research that's been conducted on this topic, sort of what sort of rigorous findings have to say about it, then perhaps they'll shift their decisions in a way that might actually lead them to be happier.
Do I get more happiness, more enjoyment out of activities that push me out of my comfort zone, that might be physically challenging, or like you talked about skydiving, that might frighten me a little bit? Do those experiences tend to generate more happiness, or is that just me being an adrenaline addict?
I think the identity relevance is probably important here. So for some people, those experiences might be especially identity relevant. For example, perhaps. But I do think that there is a difference between, so one distinction that's been made is between active leisure and passive leisure. And so passive leisure would be like laying on your couch and watching TV. What you're describing is more like active leisure, which does tend to produce more happiness. But again, I think it's not going to be the case that everyone derives happiness from skydiving. And so, I think we want to think about, how do we amp up the extent to which our experiences do the things that we hope they're doing when we invest in them? And so I do think that something like trying new things with other people, sort of that broader category, is probably a good idea, because when you're trying new things, that's going to help shape your identity. When it's with other people, it's going to prompt social interaction. And that might also make for a sort of interesting story to tell and retell after the experience has been had. And so I think there's some merit to your suggestion, but probably some nuances there that have yet to be understood as well.
Do I need to go into the experience aware that I'm entering that realm because I'm seeking happiness? Does setting some intentionality make a difference?
Sometimes that can actually backfire. So if you're hoping to get lots of happiness out of it, you might set expectations so high that you end up not getting as much happiness out of it as you hoped that you would. And so I think one has to be careful about sort of pursuing happiness for happiness' sake. Rather, one way to think about this that might be useful is happiness as being sort of a positive consequence of doing things that we want to do with others. And so I think pursuing our social relationships probably makes a bit more sense in terms of an intention to set. How do we cultivate our relationships, our connections to others? That's going to be something that's likely to make us happy. And investing in experiences is one way to do that. And so if that's what we're trying to do, I think we will often end up feeling happier as a result.
Oh, that's great. What is the hedonic treadmill? I've heard that phrase used in areas of research in which you're active. Explain that for me.
So the hedonic treadmill has to do with this notion of adaptation or habituation. That is, that we're constant, you can think about keeping up with the Joneses as sort of the colloquial or folksy way of thinking about it. We constantly strive, we seek to acquire things, believing that they'll provide us with satisfaction, and they sometimes do, at least at first, but we eventually get used to those things, and then that makes us want to seek out more things. And so the treadmill is that we're constantly chasing after more and more without getting some longer-term benefit from it. One of the benefits of experiences is that they're somewhat resistant to this notion of hedonic adaptation. So our stuff, it continues to exist in our physical worlds. And so we see it, we constantly are around it. It continues to exist, but we might not even notice it anymore. We might not derive as much value out of it. So there's, that new dining table, something that you're getting something out of as soon as you purchase it. But pretty soon you'll want a different dining table, or you might not even think of your dining table as, something to look at as you're passing by every day. Whereas these experiences, if we're thinking about them, if we're talking to other people about them, that's how we continue to derive benefits without falling prey to some of the negative outcomes that result from the so-called hedonic treadmill.
So you've studied happiness. It's part of your research. What makes you happy, and how do you know you're happy?
It's hard to know what direction research. So sometimes the research is impacted by how you live your own life. Other times the research that you do impacts how you live your life. It's hard to know exactly which came first. I do tend to pay attention to data, though, and we've collected lots of data here. And so I think I tend to pursue my social relationships a bit more than I used to, and probably would have without conducting this research. So sometimes we just think, I'd rather not. Like, it might be weird to do this thing with that person. Maybe it's going to be uncomfortable. I'd rather just stay put, not do anything. And I think sometimes we need to get past that. And once we do, we often realize that, wow, that was great. That was delightful. That was so much fun. And I've sort of started recognizing in myself when I'm doing that and trying to overcome some of those barriers we sometimes face. So even reminding myself to, it's been a while since I've interacted with another person. That's something that I actively think about a bit more, and that might lead me to connect with someone when I might otherwise not have. And I'm hopefully at least a little bit happier as a result.
Well, that's great. I've enjoyed talking with you. I want to drop something on you that I heard was attributed to Johnny Depp. And supposedly somebody asked him, can money buy happiness? And his answer allegedly was, well, I don't know, but you can dock the yacht close enough to get the vibe. I thought, okay, I see where he's going with that one. Okay, I get that. Are there any sayings about happiness that ring true with you and that stick with you, that guide how you operate and move through life?
I guess I'd push back on Mr. Depp's assessment a little bit, because sailing, as you mentioned, is an experience that could contribute to our happiness, but luxury yachts are in the realm of material possessions. That gets a bit confusing. So I do think you have to think about, well, what are the experiences that you're having, and how are those contributing to your sense of self and to your social relationships and to your overall happiness? If you're thinking about the possession-like tangible qualities of the things that you have, you're probably more likely to fall prey to that hedonic treadmill that we were talking about just a bit ago. And so, the version of that you sometimes see in these like kitschy souvenir stores and things like that is like, money can't buy happiness, but it can buy ice cream or something like that.
Yeah, right.
And I do think that that's actually a little bit closer to the practical advice that might be useful for people. So the yacht example is a little bit confusing because it's, well, should I buy a yacht? Whereas if you're imagining eating, the experience of sharing an ice cream cone with a friend of yours on a pleasant day, that's a lot closer to what's probably going to lead to a happier life than all the boats that you could buy.
Yeah, I don't know how I steered this into the whole boating thing, but I'm going to leave it. I'll wrap things up with a slogan I saw on the side of a sailboat one day that has stuck with me, and that is, die with memories, not with dreams. And I think that kind of goes back to what you were saying, experiences are what really pay off and bring the happiness. So I appreciate you talking with that about us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.